Hi everybody, this is Bina 007, back after a long hiatus with Bina 007 movie reviews. Today is going to be a slightly different format from the usual 10-minute one movie discussion. I am going to be joined today by Mathieu.
Yes, Eric on the forums.
Yeah, excellent. So by forums, he means the podcast of Ice and Fire forums. So we're going to have a lot of Song of Ice and Fire references today. But what we're going to do is a DVD commentary of the 1994 Patrice Chereau film La Reine Margot. And we are going to be commenting, I hope, both on the version that is 2 hours, 17 minutes long. So if you want to spool up your DVD so you can listen along at home, we are going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. And hopefully we're both on the right time. So, do you want to talk a little bit about...
I'm 8 seconds in.
Okay, cool. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you came to the film? Because actually I think it was you who suggested on the forums that we talk about La Reine Margot, no?
Yeah, I think I got to know about the film through one of my teachers who talked about it, a history teacher who was very enamored with the film. And so, since I'm a big movie buff and since I usually don't just limit myself to mainstream releases or more recent releases, I usually go back to watch older films as well. And that's how I got interested in, because I'm usually interested in everything medieval history and especially European medieval history, because it's not that often that you get American productions. I feel like there's maybe a cultural knowledge that's sort of lost in translation sometimes, I think, because usually when you have big Hollywood productions, they tend to focus on big battles and all that stuff. But this is actually a very politically interesting film, so that's why I sought it out, and I was actually very, very pleasantly surprised.
Have you ever seen it on the big screen?
No, I haven't. I only watched it once before on my DVD player, and yeah, this is this is the third time I've seen it, so because I watched it in preparation also to just get my mind back into it again.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same for me, actually. It's quite unusual that it's a film that I didn't see at the movie theatre. I've only ever seen it on DVD, on the small screen. But I think I probably watched it. It'd been out quite a while. I was in my first year at university and a friend recommended it. And it's kind of weird because the school I went to, we didn't really do much continental European history, like very good British history grounding. So I kind of knew about the St Bartholomew's Day massacre in some vague way. And I knew that there was the Alexandre Dumas book, but I'd never read it. So I was just utterly gripped by it, like from the first moment. And like you, I love all medieval history, so there's all that politics, which I found interesting. But also just this very flamboyant, powerful, enigmatic female lead, which was quite unusual. So,
from what I hear, actually, the real Marguerite de Valois was actually very much. I wouldn't say I wouldn't say she was completely a liberated woman, but I think she was probably much more advanced for her time. Than was much more liberated probably than other women around her, because from what I have read, she sort of made no secret about being sexually very, very active, and and having all kinds of relationships on the side, and so she was very open about it in a time where that was not the norm necessarily. So I like the fact that we get to explore that side as well, because it's not all oppressive chauvinism, and I don't know exactly if the movie does that side too much justice, but we'll get to see it anyway.
Yeah, and actually, when you think about it, the two, in a sense, it's a movie about people trying to become king of France, or the power to be king of France, and religious wars around that. But the two main characters are very powerful women. You've got Catherine de Medici, who's this incredible power broker at the head of the French royal family, and then you have Marguerite, who, like you say, very sexually liberated. I think like what really captivated me, like coming to this movie knowing nothing, like the first scene where, she's gotten married. She's kind of rejected or had a tiff with her lover on the wedding night, and then she's like, right, I need a man, on sort.
Yeah.
And I was like, I can't believe, like, you don't see that in modern films, let alone medieval films. Like, this woman just taking a man at her pleasure. It was just so radical to me.
Yeah. It's also, I think, because in European productions, usually sex is not an issue as much. It's more the violence. People are more upset about violence here in the European censors. Basically, look at that more than they look about sexual content because
Agree. And there's proper full frontal nudity, isn't there, in this picture?
yeah,
Which
especially now here in the opening, right? We got at least one shirtless guy and yeah, they're both sleeping in the same bed, which would be the opportunity for a joke about. But
absolutely Catholic and Protestant
yeah,
uncomfortable relationship there.
and people constantly keep talking, keep asking them, keep asking each other like, "Are you here for the wedding?" It's like, it's probably something that Martin would have watched in order to write some of the stuff in Song of Ice and Fire. I feel like because some of the things seem very very similar in the
Yeah.
way that they develop in the film. But
I mean, I'd love to know if he has watched this because, and certainly I wonder if the two people who make the TV show watched it because that combination of violence and sex and
yeah,
these beautiful, I mean, like the wedding scene I'm on, I hope you're on too. The costumes are just stunning.
yeah. It's like I like she's obviously in red and white, which is very symbolic already. But it's also
Yeah,
she's
it's not a very virginal white wedding gown, is it? I mean, she comes with these very
no.
painted lips, this very strong look, and her husband to be Henri de Navarre just looks like this country booby.
Yeah, it's like they refer to him as a boar at some point, right?
Absolutely.
Like he sort of smells like a goat, no, like a boar. They make they make fun of the fact that he's not Catholic and I
Ah, yeah.
or
So King
uh,
Charles has just banged her head on the.
yeah, it's
It's very I guess Sansa, sort of unwilling brides of Game of Thrones, right?
yeah. And here's where I come. I mean, here's where my comparison to some of Ice and Fire characters come in. Like King Charles seems to be an amalgamation of the two Roberts, the two Roberts that we know of in A Song of Ice and Fire, like Robert Arryn and Robert Baratheon in some ways. I feel like because he seems so sickly all the time, it seems like this is what an adult Robert Arryn would be like, right? And also kind of the way that he pushes um, Ma- um, Marguerite around, like here on the pillow. It seems like this is sort of the social isolation that that would probably come out eventually. Like this is sort of there's a sociopathic element to it, I think.
Absolutely. I find him absolutely petrifying because I think, certainly in the final scene in the film, I always believe that he truly loves Margot in a way that her brother and her mother don't. And this jealous possession he has of her, like, I'm not going to let her go. And
Mm.
yet he does these very cold things towards her, and it just, like she says at one point in the film, he just changes every day. You can't trust him, and I never figured out whether it was a true physical ailment, like sometimes he seems to have fits, whether it is something sort of psychological. But he's a very enigmatic figure. I don't know if there's a historical answer to this. Did
I
you
think
study
you
all this in school, by the way? Was this no?
No, sadly I didn't. I mean, the fact is I mostly studied European history as in a general sense. Like we would focus on different elements throughout history, but we never got to focus much on the Middle Ages. Sadly enough, we sort of moved right from antiquity to more modern history, like 16. Let's say the 16th, 17th century. We sort of
Ah,
skipped
okay.
the Middle Ages because the Middle Ages are a bit, yeah, it's all. I mean, there's so many changes happening, at least in territories and in monarchies and all that stuff. It's very hard to keep track of it. Um, but
Well, even this period, right? The wars of religion. It's just
yeah,
insane.
and especially here, like what she's saying, like she's. I mean, I think like the uh, Henry of Navarra. He seems like a bit of a Tyrion here, right? Because she doesn't want to let him into her bed. She just tells him like, don't
But
come to my
also
table
because
tonight.
he's quite pragmatic, isn't he?
Yeah,
He's kind of like Tyrion Stats. Like we're both in this awkward situation. We both know that this is just a political marriage. But from the start, he's like, "Why don't we ally? Like your family have put you through this. Let's try and
it's
help each other out." And she's just like completely. I love her look here. It's so disdainful.
yeah, it's just stoic, like no, no. I mean, no emotion whatsoever because she does actually at this point she doesn't care about it. It's a political affair anyway to get the two fractions of this religious war to sort of get peaceful towards each other. But
And then the Duke de Guise, her lover, just like looking so cocky, sitting in the aisle all the time, like, yeah, I own her. What I also used to find really like funny watching this film is that when Catherine de Medici says to Charlotte de Sauve, like, can you go and seduce Henri de Navarre for me? She never thinks twice.
No. It's like, it's just some natural to it. But yeah, now I see like Charlotte, who is sort of also kind of, seductress. And it's also like, later in this scene, she is going to try to seduce Henry anyway. And that's sort of, on his wedding day of all things. So it's like, the hypocrisy that goes into this kind of thing. They all talk about, well, my religion versus your religion. And then I don't know that they keep that. They're not that faithful anyway.
Yeah, for sure. So. It's just power. Religion is just a power base in as well. But I love the fact that in this scene you've basically got Henriette, you've got Margot, and later Charlotte de Sauve, and they're all basically just picking up men. Yeah. And they're very in control. Margot and Henriette are quite literally going through a list of wedding guests and like ranking the guys out of 10 practically, saying, yeah, he's hot, he's not so hot. And then you have Charlotte de Sauve, like you say, like very aggressively picking up Henri and saying, and he's like, well, it's my wedding night. Yeah, and she's like, it's tonight or no night. So again, it just overturns every expectation you have of these modest, and the bodices are undone. It's just, it's brilliant.
Yeah, which is also like, that's why I tend to roll my eyes a little bit whenever you have films about medieval times that are sort of trying to portray all women as either sexually repressed, or oppressed. So like they're subservient to the men around them, which is not the case everywhere, but and not, it's not. It depends on the individual, I guess. And in that sense, she was an example of a progressive thinker, in at least in these matters. But at the same time, we see her like saying that she probably doesn't want to go with a Protestant anyway. So yeah, which is very. Which today you would say, well, what's wrong with you, right? But it's probably the environment anyway. It's like people living in groups of. And usually not leaving them, which is, at least at the moment, seems to be like this is why the wedding is such a big deal. I feel like, because they are people who have completely different beliefs on a religious basis, and who are meant to be sort of to bring two communities together, which is, it's a sort of responsibility, but it doesn't. There are no emotions that flow from that necessarily.
Absolutely not. Oh, here comes Charlotte de Sauve.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's so I don't know. There's no doubt that he's going to fall for her, right? It's hilarious to me.
Yeah, because what does he have to hope for from Margot? I feel like he doesn't. He doesn't stand a chance, actually, because he who is basically the person in charge in that relationship at this point, right?
Oh, for sure. I think I've always thought what was a bit of a shame in this film, or in general in sort of historical fiction, is people focus obviously on what would have been quite scandalous, which is her sexual liberation.
Yeah.
But in reality, she was incredibly well educated, and when she was imprisoned after this film, later by her husband. For 18 years, I think, she wrote her memoirs and journals, and you realise that she was sort of deeply involved in diplomacy and politics, and really very learned. And you don't get that from this film. In this film, it's the tale of a girl who's kind of almost quite flighty and arrogant and spoiled, and maybe Sansa-ish. And then finding her humanity as she falls in love, and finding her sense of wisdom and purpose. So listeners, just so you know that the conversation may have seemed to have a cut. It's because we had to restart the call, but that should be seamless. So continue playing your DVD. And we now have a slightly homoerotic scene of the younger brother of the King of France wrestling with the Duke de Guise, who's...
Two dudes fighting half naked, which is always good.
And both of whom are apparently the lovers of Margot. So rumour that she slept with her brothers... Oh.
Yeah, Duke of Anguille, I think.
Duke, he's Anjou, and the younger one.
Anjou, sorry.
And his little one is Anguilleme. or I hope I get those. Oh, Alençon, trying to get them the right way around.
Yeah, and now we see the nanny of the king, entering a room of political discussion, which is always, as you do.
I love this. Anytime I see an admiral, a bishop, a king, I'm very excited. And you just see how frail he is. I mean, I'd love to know from many historians, like, how seriously ill he was, or whether he was just like Sweet Robin, a sort of spoiled little boy.
I think we're in the years of decline here, because he was 20, just, I think 26, was he, when he died? Or I don't know.
Yeah,
He was very young.
And younger than he looks here. I think this actor probably looks older than he was in reality.
Yeah, but that's to be expected. The only thing is that we are told that the admiral sort of has influence over him, which is also something that was a worry for Catherine de Medici in real life. So we definitely, because he seems to be the king seems to be completely uninterested in the discussion around him.
No, you're absolutely right, aren't you? I mean, I think the whole point here is that Catherine de Medici had been married to a very powerful king who died, and saw her chance, as Cersei did with Joffrey, to rule. And, the influence of Admiral Coligny is definitely, it's a rival for his affection and for his ear. So I always thought that this kind of concept of Catholic versus Protestant as the reason for the war, okay, it's true. But really it's just that Coligny is a Protestant and she needs to remove a power base that isn't her own. And of course, the same for the Guise family, right? They just want to get rid of Coligny because they feel, if anything, they should be more powerful than him, if not the royal family itself. So
the only thing that I, at least from what I got, what I know from the reception of the film at the time, was when you read Roger Ebert's review of the film, he seems to say that there is no context given to any of these people because people in America would not be knowledgeable enough about these historical figures, right? That there is not enough introduction as to who they are and what they want, etc., etc. But I feel like this is sort of how you do like intelligent. I mean, at least you don't want to make it too easy and too explicit for the audience what the characters think or do, or I don't know. It has to have some kind of ambiguity. So I like the fact that it pushes people to do research on these topics.
But I also don't think it's that hard. I mean, I was really surprised when I read that Roger Ebert review, because I really respect him as a critic and I normally agree with what he says. And when he gave it such a bad review for reasons of, lack of context and confusion, and I thought, well, when I first watched it, I didn't know anything about French history. And I found it easy to follow. And I think, scenes like this very pivotal scene where you're seeing the different factions behind the wars of religion, are very, for me, like you say, it intrigues you. You want to read more around it, but I did find it easy to follow. So I really hope that review and reviews like it didn't put people off watching the film, because I don't think it's hard. And it works at a very basic kind of emotional level as well.
No, of course, you care about the characters even if you don't exactly know who they are, because at least the king and his brothers, they have like similar hairstyles, and if you're not really paying attention too much, then you probably would mix them up. But I guess there's no real... it's like if I watch a film about American history, I'm as a European, I'm not usually given all the context as well, because it's usually taken for granted that Americans know their own history. It's much more like they throw names casually around as well. So it's like, do the legwork, essentially, is what I'm saying.
I love it. I love your no nonsense, no sympathy attitude. Yeah, do the legwork, mofos.
Yeah. It's because I usually I'm interested in all these topics. So even if it's if it's less obvious here,
excellent scene. Sorry, it's just like Henri de Navarre just going in like biting the Duc de Guise.
Yeah, you would try to get his nose, like got your nose.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. That was just it's too good not to comment on.
Does he kiss him? Does he bite him? Probably bites him, right?
Well, it's very ambiguous, right?
Yeah, he doesn't bleed or anything, so I guess he was just,
But, having narrated this film, effectively translated it word for word for my family as I was watching it over Christmas.
Oh, really?
It's at a very basic level. I mean, it's, you know that the Protestants, the dour guys in black, and the Catholics are the flamboyant guys in colour. I mean, I think it's very colour-coded as a film, and very... It was kind of interesting watching it with my friend Kirili, who doesn't speak any French whatsoever, and she knows no French history. She's very bright, but she's Australian, so she's not studied this stuff. And she said that... So once again, we say to people, if you notice a slight interruption in the conversation, we had to restart the call, but hopefully third time's the charm. So we continue with the wonderful Virna Lisi, who's actually much younger than the character she plays here.
Yeah, that's actually. I mean, it's not unusual because sometimes people look younger than they actually are, but they or the other way around. But here she's sort of. I mean, she has a slight accent, right? I mean, I noticed that.
Well, a very definite accent, and I think it's just genius to cast an Italian to play this Italian princess who was married into the French royal family, because even to my English ears, you could tell it was very different, and I think it brought this air of exotic to the French court, and the idea that, I guess it's the kind of medieval, not racism, but sort of countryism, that here she comes from Italy, the country of the Borgias, with her poisoning, because this movie and the book, I guess, very much give the theory that Catherine de' Medici poisoned, well, potentially her husband. Certainly she poisoned Henri de Navarre's mother. And, as we will see as the movie goes on, she tries to poison many other people via her cosmetic guy, Moraval, I guess. But she's not above assassinations. She's definitely almost like a witch figure. Like, they always dress her in black, sort of in the shadows.
Well,
very tragic figure, I think.
Well, I mean, very, very... I mean, she's dressed in colours that make her stand out from everyone else, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
And the hair, I mean, the hair is always, like, she's definitely has a different style. It's very rigid, I mean, in the way that she dresses and so and conducts herself, which is always a bit, I mean, she's very much restrained. When we just met the son, who is very much like a hot mess. So, the contrast is very, very stark here.
She reminds me a little bit of Tywin Lannister, because everything she does is very austere and very much for the family, and yet, despite everything being for the family, she doesn't really show much genuine emotion for the family, apart from the slightly incestuous love she has for the second son.
And despite, that's the thing. To me, she's not. I mean, if we're going to go by counterparts in A Song of Ice and Fire, what women characters do we know that? I mean, I would probably say Olenna Tyrell would probably be a very close analogy, because obviously of the poisoning and all that stuff. If people don't catch up, I mean, if people haven't caught up with books 3 yet, so I think that, as a matriarch goes, she's probably the closest that I can think of. But she doesn't have any sort of that. I mean, she's definitely not an enjoyable presence. Like, she's not someone that you want to be around, and she wouldn't want you around either. So there's the difference, I guess. But
yeah, she's. I mean, I find Catherine de' Medici in here absolutely petrifying. I mean, you just would not want to mess with that woman.
And steamy sex scene.
Oh yes, the wedding night of Margot, which obviously isn't with her actual husband.
No, which is the most insulting thing probably for him, right? I mean, but even though he doesn't take it that way, he's actually very reasonable in that sense, because he understands how much of a difficulty it is.
Yeah, but he still goes along to her room to sort of try and broker a peace. So.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. I think that he takes it actually reasonably well, given the circumstances where you would say, well, I'm your husband, especially in those times where you would say, as your husband and on a wedding night, shouldn't we do this or something? It's just like, but he leaves her enough of a choice, at least in the film, to sort of say no, and he respects her decision.
I suppose what I find even weirder is, in the context of this time, and even to much later in European history, when you had a sort of a marriage alliance like this, typically there would be this big bedding ceremony where all the aristos would come in and the priest would bless the bed, and everyone would want evidence that the marriage is consummated.
You've been watching Elizabeth again, haven't you? There's also this scene where people keep spying on Kate Blanchett's character.
Absolutely. But that's the point. Like, no one's even watching them here apart from Henriette, who's a bit of a voyeur. And it's kind of like, it's as though the whole court expects nothing to happen. No one's even looking for a consummation.
Because they are actually, I mean, this is sort of begrudgingly made as a alliance, basically, because they actually don't want to do it, all because of questions of religion and all that stuff, which is still to people like us today that would not normally, you would say, well, why would that actually be the case? But I mean, it's just religion, but in those circumstances, it was probably much more important.
Do you believe that the Duc de Guise loves Margot in any way, or do you think he's shagging her basically because he wants power?
I think it's probably, I mean, a mix of both. I mean, I wouldn't venture out to say whether it's one or the other. So I would probably go for the middle road and say, well, it's probably, there are definitely some feelings there, because once her husband leaves, he sort of looks like he's a bit wounded, sort of.
Yeah, he looks genuinely hurt now. And even when she says to him, "You didn't take my virginity, so take my wedding night," I always feel that when he's asking about the brothers, I mean, it could be cruel, but I think it's almost like he genuinely is quite hurt and quite possessive of her. Like, he doesn't like the idea of someone else being with her. So, I mean, he's a cocky little shit, and obviously I don't like the role of the role of the Guise family in French history has always been rather troublesome and grasping for power, but I think the way they play it in the film is quite subtle. Like, it's quite ambiguous. You can interpret it in different ways.
And actually, what I find actually rather refreshing is that these people, they're not talking about their relationship or anything like that. They're not. This is, I mean, even though this is the context for a romantic encounter to happen, it's actually not about this, because everything that we've seen so far has shown us that this is not a marriage about. I mean, this is not feelings being relevant at all. Actually, this is politics, and so they talk about political things. And as a woman, in those, I mean, I usually hate to use that phrase, but in those times, it seems like that would absolutely not happen. But here she's sort of talking. That you see that they're equal in the way that they debate with each other. So that's something I like about it, because it shows a different side of the. I mean, it's definitely the Middle Age. I mean, if it's not. I mean, Renaissance definitely has changed quite a bit of things, but not that much. At least
I agree
in terms of women's position, right? So this is rather a standout. And I feel like people who are not familiar with all the historical details, they might feel probably that this is sort of how you do things, because nowadays showing misogyny within that society would obviously sometimes be rather difficult, because there's always the question of whether you're endorsing it or whether you're just commenting on it without saying anything about it. But here, this is sort of a natural thing, because she's an extraordinary character within that context. So I like it in the sense that it shines a light on the fact that she can hold her own against all these men around her, even though she doesn't have any power. And that's actually something that I've read up on, because I was rather interested in it, because apparently she wasn't allowed to be queen because of Salic law.
Absolutely, the French arrangement is much less beneficial to women than actually the English concept of inheritance.
Yeah, which is also something that, I mean, it's at least Salic law goes back to Clovis, right?
Absolutely, it's really old.
Yeah, and it's these details, right, where you see like law and politics and human human contact and social interaction mingling all together to sort of create a very complex picture.
But for all those reasons, and especially like this concept of Salic law, so in France, she was born as a woman and so could never inherit power in the way that Elizabeth I could. No. And yet, in that context of an almost more misogynistic setup than you had in England at the same time, you have this guy, Henri de Navarre, who treats with Margot, or kind of tries to have a political discussion about an alliance that very much, like as you said, treats her as an equal. And I always really respected him for that whether or not the Duc de Guise loves her or not, he uses her sexually, as does potentially her brother, and her mother uses her by making her make this marriage. But, Henri de Navarre is the first guy who comes into her life and treats her as an equal, as someone with intellect who can be reasoned with, and who can and actually he doesn't push the sexual side, which he could, demanding his right of, the marriage night. And says, what, I'm going to treat you as someone with whom we can make a political bargain. And in a way, I think that's very close to Tyrion Sansa. Yeah. And sadly, Sansa, much like Margot here, isn't quite up to accepting that yet. But I'd love to know if George had seen this, because the more I think about it, the more it relates in a way.
Because, the way at least the film portrays her, she sort of punishes him for something, at least because we know that she doesn't like the Huguenots she's a Catholic anyway, so that's probably where she comes from as well. So the gaps of religion as well as the forced marriage all make it very difficult for her to sort of accept him or his help in any way. And so now she sort of seeks out these simpler pleasures of life, I would call them, by
the necessities. I always think of her in this scene as just thinking, you know what, I just need to balance my hormones, so let's just go get a guy. It's just so crude. It's so physical. There's just nothing. And always Henriette just looking on, smiling. It's just bizarre.
And given what we know of, how this relationship ends, you sort of go like, was there really that much, that you would go that far at the end, sort of like to, we can sort of, can we spoil it at this point, or is it, should we keep it for the end?
I think we can talk about at the end, like what actually was going on in that relationship, or maybe as we go through.
Yeah.
But I've always felt that it was more the point of principle for Margot, that she'd kind of discovered her humanity a little bit through this relationship and the possibility of having a relationship with a Protestant, and therefore it was more symbolic to her that she, just as the night of St Bartholomew's Day massacre, that she needs to save this one soul throughout this whole movie, just to prove to herself that she's better than these people around her who were so callous.
And I would actually, I now actually consider mine is the 2 hour 17 minutes version of the film. So I wonder whether or not this scene wasn't cut out. This sex scene in the American, I'm not sure if they cut out some of the sex scenes, because we talked about, at least in pre-discussion, about the fact that there was a different version of the film distributed in the US, right?
I think actually also maybe certainly in the UK. I think it's shorter, but I think it's also different. It's not so much that they just took out scenes. I think they also added in extra scenes to emphasize the relationship with this guy she's just shagged, de la Mole, and Margot, because they wanted to emphasize the kind of the romantic, as you said before, the romantic relationship rather than the politics. So it's not just that scenes have been taken out. There were scenes that were on the cutting room floor for the longer version that have been added in. But I have to say, I think I saw the other version originally. It was a long time ago, but it doesn't feel that different to me.
Yeah, it's not that much actually. It's just 15 minutes more, and if they're dispersed throughout the film, then you would probably not notice it that much, I guess. And I think this here is sort of like, also I have to say this was probably the worst disguise ever, just like a small little mask, and but I guess it's just sort of meant to show that there's practically no distance between her and him, basically. Maybe that's how I perceived it.
and now he's selling his book because he doesn't have any money left. Um,
The
and
fateful book.
yeah, it's about hunting, and that's also something like King Charles, um, the ninth actually published. I mean, he wrote a book about hunting and hounds, and
Oh, really? I
yeah,
didn't realize. Okay.
it was published, and it's actually a very good reference book from what I hear. It's very much it's very useful.
And
Which
was
shows that
Henri de Navarre really like the champion boar hunting guy?
not Navarra, but I think Charles Charles Margot's brother. I think he probably he was we saw him with feeding his hound right at the
Oh,
beginning.
Auteil, yes.
Yeah, and so it's like I guess some people have different put different emphasis. I mean, I guess if he hadn't been so young, he probably might have um, made a better king if he had been given enough opportunity to sort of ease into the responsibility as much as being thrust into the situation by the death of his father, right?
Oh,
Um,
now this scene is really interesting.
yeah,
So we've had the assassination attempt on Coligny,
yeah,
so the Protestant, and immediately, so this always like really interested me. Like, so you go from Margot basically rejecting her husband, and then but immediately she goes to try and warn him to leave, and
mm,
his stupid Protestant advisors are like, "Why would we trust her? She's one of them." But it seems incredibly sincere. So she's gone from this very kind of flirtatious, arrogant woman into someone who genuinely seems to care. Or my reading, I don't know about you. She genuinely seems to
oh
want him
yeah.
to go at this point.
And here we see the brother again, right? Henry the
Yep.
Third, I think is he's going to be right eventually, um, and you sort of get the idea that I mean at least the king here in the scene was sort of like really detached from everything, right? He's sort of in the middle because he doesn't really know how to react to all this, um, and here now we have all the Protestant uh, friends of Margot's husband, right? Or arguing against her because they think that because she's a Catholic, she doesn't know how to. I mean, they feel like they can't trust her, right? So it's really um, actually. I mean, I would say that there's a stubbornness to both sides here. Um,
But
but
I have
the
a good
one,
friend, in fact, the friend who introduced me to this film, who always found the transformation of the woman who rejects Henri de Navarre to the one who the very next day comes and wants him to leave almost too sudden. Like,
I
what was
guess,
the motivation of her sticking her neck out, taking the risk of going to his chambers, because if her family find out she's warning them, then she's in trouble.
yeah, I could see probably that it's. I mean, it's not that sudden to me because she had a detailed and a long discussion with him on their wedding night. So I guess she was aware of his point of view, and she has seen that he's not. I mean, that he's not shallow in the way that the other people around her seem to be, and that he's not. I mean, he actually talked about things that were important.
Yeah.
Um,
So
so
even though she seemed to be rejecting him sort of by keeping this austere face, inside she must have been internalizing it and thinking, actually, this guy's pretty sensible.
no, yeah, which is actually to me is exemplified when she sends her lover
Yeah.
away after that discussion. So now the second scene with her and her husband seems to be actually much more, um, yeah, realistic.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness. So this scene, I'd love to know what you think of the scene. Do you think the king... So the legend goes that the Protestants, after the assassination attempt on Coligny, were getting riotous. And so the Catholics decided that they would take out, the top 10 to 15 leaders of the Protestant movement.
oh
And they
yeah,
needed the king's approval. And then the king apparently famously said, "Leave no one alive to reproach me," which is why it became a widespread massacre. How far do you think the king really knew? Or does history prove it either way? Because I think you've probably read more about it than me.
well,
And
it seems at least and at least in the film, it seems to be a very a decision made on the spot, basically, where he's sort of put in a corner and has to say something because they're all arguing for one thing, and he doesn't know. I mean, he knows that what's happening wasn't right, but at the same time, I feel like he doesn't want to be blamed for anything for the attempt on Coligny. So it's like, how do you react to this? I mean, and this is definitely the wrong choice to make, right? And we know that there are conflicting accounts on how he himself felt in real life about this.
But he's rolling around on the floor. I mean, do you think he's having a fit, or is it just grief and trauma? I never know with him. It's so weird.
Yeah, he's. I mean, that's what I like about it. Is because the performance gets you to interpret different things into it. So you could say that maybe he's just, completely off his, completely bonkers or anything, and that he just randomly says something which is like kill everyone, or maybe he's stricken with grief and he probably feels like he wants to, do something, strong, and I don't know. He seems very conflicted here. He doesn't. Even though he says like kill them all, he also says there shouldn't be anyone left to accuse me or to blame me or something like that. It seems like I can't really. I mean, from what I know of the real person, he seemed to at times be really proud of what he had, what was done. But on other hand, in other situations, it would probably be renouncing everything and saying, it's my mother, it's her who's responsible, and what do I tell God when I meet him and all that stuff, repentant about what had gone down. So I think it's probably correct to say that the man was very conflicted about the whole thing in the end. And I mean, so I can't say very much if he actually approved of it in the aftermath or not. That's because we know that he at points would reject any responsibility in it because it was such a bad thing that had happened. So, but still, he was, as the king, he was responsible for giving the order to do it anyway. So, I mean, he has to bear at least that responsibility.
I mean, what I always find amazing is though that they're counting on their hands of the people that they should kill. And then he says, everyone, no one should be left to reproach me. And then they suddenly decide, even though he's obviously mentally unstable and very vulnerable, to take that as a direct order. Now, if the Duc de Guise or Catherine de Medici at that point had said, no, don't be, look, calm down, it'll just be 14, we can contain this, he probably would have then, because he's so changeable, said, yeah, fine, let's just do that. But it's like they would never have had the audacity to ask for a massacre, but as soon as he says this one line, without a beat, they all accept that as the direct order and make it happen. Which is, it tells you something about their mindset. It's just so far gone,
They don't have any consideration for them as, and that's the thing, we talk about, in terms of human rights today and, the value of the human life, but at the end of the day, in those days, those concepts didn't really exist. So it's like you are either, one of our compatriots, or you're someone who is potentially an enemy, and you don't count as a person. So they probably don't feel much remorse in doing this anyway.
And I guess that's reflected, if that's the kind of just basic Catholic mindset, and the fact that as soon as they do start this massacre, which is now unraveling very graphically on screen, the people of Paris join in, and actually apparently it spread to other towns and villages and went on for like 9 or 10 days. So there was obviously this general latent anti-Protestant feeling that could very quickly be tapped into at this point.
Yeah, and I could see this happening, like this kind of stuff happening later on in A Song of Ice and Fire, this sort of thing, like they close the doors to the city until the deed is done. And this kind of massacre seems like really Red Wedding-ish, I would say, because they are all, actually the Protestants are all there for the wedding, at least from...
Oh, absolutely, yes, they're violating guest rights.
And then they get slaughtered afterwards. I mean, in Song of Ice and Fire, it's at the wedding, but here it's difficult not to draw comparisons because of what we have read in those books, and at least it shows that they are real life counterparts to that. So
Oh, absolutely. And this concept of, I mean, no one mentions the violation of guest right, but, you know, people do say, like, when later in the film, when Margot is trying to plead with her brother and she says, "You've damned us all to hell that night, and what's even worse, you used me, you lured them all here as my guests," and she does make the point that not only was the murder horrible, but the fact that they were lured under the pretense of being guests in the protection of the Louvre, it's just doubly bad. So,
what I find really weird is that Henriette is sort of like walking around casually, and even warning this guy to, you know, watch out for Protestant who is getting up again, and then later on she sort of changed her mind or something.
Henriette is just fascinating to me. Like she to me is like the ultimate coquette. You know, she never has, like Margot, this like deep emotional journey, but she's always just playing with people, and especially with Coconut. I mean, if she's inciting him to violence, and then she's kind of, it's so mischievous. I love that character, and I love the look of the actress. I think she's stunning, and she just has this very medieval look with the red hair sort of side parted, and it's just one of these wonderful visuals. No, I mean,
it looks like a bit of Queenie, like from Blackadder, I would say.
Yes, absolutely.
But now we get into like the big executions here, like at least, you know, and he's wearing red. Like, this is really obvious as a metaphor, but
red in tooth and claw.
Really effective as well, I guess, because now they're killing women as well, and I think the actor who first like drew the pistol, I think he's a German actor, isn't he?
Yes, he is. Isn't it Thomas Kretchman?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's him. And he was also like in The Downfall, where he played Fegelein, I think.
Yes, you're right.
And he's been. I mean, because I've been exposed to lots of German television as a younger kid. I remember him from other things as well, but he's not a big role here. It's just I recognized him, which is weird because it was originally, I think it's a it was a French-Italian production, wasn't it?
What, this film?
Yeah.
Yes, I think it was. Which may speak to why they had to have some Italian actors in it, actually, because the guy who plays Coconut is also Italian, isn't he?
And so now they check if they've killed him now. Be damned, or damn you. And they break his neck by, it's, you wouldn't actually, that's also something like, I don't like it when in medieval films or, shows or whatever, when the main characters sort of, they die after a very long struggle, when we see how frail human bodies are. It's like this sort of the idea of the invincible hero who is never, who can stand like 50 cuts to his body, and who can, survive a cannon shot and all that stuff. This is.
But don't you think De La Mole is a little bit like that? Like, I was watching it, like, of course, with these people who'd never seen it before over Christmas, and they're like, "Are they dead?" And I was like, I kept saying, well, it's part of the story of the film that these two people must be united through all their kind of, craziness. And at one point they were like, this is like Tom and Jerry. It's like you can hit the cat over the head 50 times and he's still going to come up running,
Yeah, it's also, I think, that's why I think this is these images of people just lying dead everywhere. It just emphasizes, how easy it could be, how easily this could be done. And that's a terrifying thought. But here he's sort of like trying to get away, and they know where he is going. And at least I don't know if this scene is really the historically accurate, I would say, but it still gets the point across that she's sort of like she stands out among all the others, right? That she recognizes the barbarity of it anyway, and she recognizes that even though they don't share the same religion, that he shouldn't die. But at the same time, you could still ask yourself, is it because she likes him as a person, because she had sex with him earlier? But I guess this goes farther this goes farther than that. I mean, on a superficial reading, probably people would say, you know, oh yeah, she protects them because they're in love or something. But I think it's actually because she recognizes that this is not, you know, that this is awful in any circumstances.
I agree, and I think that almost that sort of that marketing manager thing of trying to make it more about the love story actually trivializes her, and it puts her in the box of the romantic heroine who can only be motivated to do something because of like teenage romance.
Yeah.
Whereas actually her journey, I think, is, I mean, of course they are. I think there is a point at which she feels she's in love with him, but I think it's much more profound than that, and it's about, amidst all this chaos, if I can save just one person, if I can make the point, I can declare this my territory, you know? But it's a wonderful story, right? I mean, it's a wonderful coincidence, certainly.
Yeah. No, I just have to get the cable for my computer because the battery is halfway done. So
okay.
I'm just going to leave for 2 seconds. And
no problem. It's probably actually while Mathieu is away, saying something about Patrice Chereau, who directed this film, he's actually not really a film director. He's a director of theatre and opera. And I think that probably speaks to why, I mean, one of the reasons why I love this film is that the costumes are so lavish. And a lot of his staging is just this beautiful tableau. So the wedding scene at the start is just unbelievably stunning. This sort of tableau of rich, vivid colour, the aristocrats of France. And then you've had this graphic back. A lot of the imagery he uses is from fine art. So that when you see Margot and Henriette stripping the Comte de la Mole and tending to him, there's a lot of Christ-like imagery from those Renaissance oil paintings. So,
and I'm back.
I was just talking about how I think the fact that Patrice Chereau is a theatre and opera director means that a lot of his staging is very tableau-like and theatrical. But also, that, do you not think that when they're stripping the Comte de la Mole and all the blood on his body and the wounds, there's something kind of Christ-like in that imagery? Right? Like a very religious kind of an image in a way?
It seems, I mean, the first thing that came to mind to me was the painting, The Death of Marat.
Yeah, definitely.
17. I mean, that's an 18th century or 18th century painting. No, it was early 19th. Yeah, probably around that. You know, early 19th. Yeah, this is sort of where she looks at him like, you know, as probably more than just she wants to have sex with, but and there is Charlotte, I think, right?
Charlotte de Silve, yes.
Yeah.
It's very weird, though. I mean, the whole concept of the massacre, I find, like her going to plead with her family to save her husband. I mean, it's just such a radical turnaround, and really, she's putting herself in grave danger here.
And what I find interesting is that this, usually you would say that the massacre would be like the big climax to something. You would have all the build up, and then at some point there would be at the end of the film, in a different film, there would be a lot of tension throughout the film, and then the massacre would be the climax, right? Here it's in the middle of the film because we have to deal with all the consequences of it, and all the aftermath, which is actually much more interesting than just the slaughter itself. The slaughter itself, in the end, is an awful thing that happens and that happened in history. But it's also important to see how everyone reacted to it and how they perceived it in the aftermath, because these people, you know, they changed their minds on things. You know, they weren't all, you know, just one huge mass that agreed with itself. They all they either came around to accepting how bad it was, or they kept justifying and rationalizing it. So it's really interesting to see how they deal with it, and how she now goes to her brother and comforts him when you know it's clear that he's, you know, the person who gave the go ahead, basically.
Absolutely. But also, I mean, it makes sense, right, historically, because ultimately all these things that I guess Catherine de Medici tries to do, which is the radical solutions, the massacre, assassinations, poisoning, they never end the religious conflict. And
No.
so you can't have the massacre at the end of them because it has no finality, and that's kind of the point. That, I mean, this is a woman who is obsessed with prophecy, so another Circe link, and tries to kind of overturn prophecy by, having people removed, and it never works. It always backfires. And so it's absolutely right to me that the massacre is at the heart of the film, kind of halfway through the running time as well, because there is no finality. And ultimately, that's what is Catherine's undoing, that she's going to live to see all her plans undone.
And she's suitably in black, or I would rather say hypocritically, because she doesn't grieve in any way for these people.
I suspect she was probably like Queen Victoria, that when her husband died, she went into mourning and sort of never came out.
Yeah, that's probably it. And Margot advised, and if I understood it right, she advises him to convert as well.
Yeah, Paris is worth a mass. I mean, just stay alive is what she's saying. She's very pragmatic. She's grown up in this very callous, pragmatic political family. So, and he's also in favour of that, right? Because he's also a pragmatic man. And
now he can stand up and fight, despite.
It's just ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's part of it's part of. It's just sort of like to embody like of it. So he's like why. It's a social conflict where every side sort of is convinced that they're absolutely right because they're fighting over a question of religion, and it's very difficult to make people feel empathetic, at least in this context, to the person of a differing opinion.
Agreed.
And I think in the sense that these people are all convinced that they're doing this as a matter of faith, that they are. At least the guy who just got murdered, he basically said it's for God that these people are dying. It's because we have to do this in the name of Catholicism and all that stuff. And there are people who basically see beyond these limitations. But I feel like in an environment where the church is basically a very powerful entity, you might.
But is it though? Because the reality is, in this film, we never see an archbishop or a bishop in any of these political discussions.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Like it's not like in Game of Thrones, where you now start having this sort of like extremist religious faction trying to control King's Landing. I mean, actually, what's fascinating about here is that everything is apparently superficially done in the name of religion, but none of these people are religious. They convert on a tuppenny piece, backwards and forwards in the case of Henri.
It's probably
it's just an excuse or a veil for power bases.
Yeah, it's keeping yourself in a position of authority, basically. It's removing people who are potentially a threat to you.
Yeah, so I think religion probably meant a great deal to the peasants and the people in the country, and therefore they can be whipped up into a mob when the massacre starts. But
yeah.
I think for these people at the top, they're utterly, in a way, very modern, very post-religious. And you see that in their sexual morality, you see that in their extreme practicality. It's almost like a very kind of nihilistic practicality. Like, I don't think they hold to any values, really. It's just power and survival.
I would say that this is a question of individuals, right? Because I wouldn't say that the people who are in power are all necessarily hypocrites. It's just that the people who were responsible for this here probably on some level were aware of the inhumanity of what they were doing, and how, I mean, you would have to really be you have to rationalize it to a huge degree if you were to convert the teachings of Jesus, who said, your enemy, hold your I mean, if your enemy slaps you once, basically you have to let them slap you twice or something. You hold the other cheek, right?
Yeah.
These people don't do this at all, and actually, they did it after a Huguenot essentially was, nearly assassinated, and then it wasn't even that they themselves were, attacked or something. They just use it because they felt that it was probably going to be a starting point for something else that might happen. They were afraid that the Huguenots would rise up and start trouble. So this is very much a preventive measure, which is also, I mean, it basically makes the case for the Huguenots I mean, they couldn't have made the Catholics look worse than the Catholics did to themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always thought it was deeply ironic that probably the most Christian man in this whole thing is the executioner who saves Coconnas and the Comte de la Mole by saving their lives, recognizing that they're still alive and feeding them and nursing them back to health. And yet, in the society of the time, he would be seen as, in a way, the most callous. And yet this guy, the executioner, shows the most basic humanity of anyone in the film.
And here's Margot speaking out publicly against all this, which I find is, I mean, it's also unusual for the time, because usually I think women would not speak about such things in public, right? They would not. I think in a society like this, they would probably not usually be allowed to do this. But since she's,
but maybe it's an aristocratic woman, though, because I mean, if you read her journals, she was obviously involved in diplomacy and politics at the highest level. So I think maybe an exception for princesses of the blood.
And here we have Henry again, and yeah, I see. I just think that it's very difficult for me with, you know, at least with my current in the modern society, to look at these people and say, well, you know, there was no humanity in any of them. I think there is, which is why they are capable of doing what they did. But it's also, I mean, I can recognize that they would feel threatened by an uprising of the Protestants, but at the same time, this does not justify anything that they did.
I love the line in here where the future Henri III is like, "What's the matter, Margot? Your husband's just become Catholic. You're not going to become Protestant, are you?"
Yeah, that's also like mocking what is essentially a really awful situation, because, you know, in those days, I mean, it's not like today where you can basically say, "Oh, I'm no longer a Protestant. I'm an agnostic, or I'm an atheist." And even then, you have to be careful where you say that, you know. Especially, I mean, I don't know what the public opinion in the US is of atheists, but I somehow have an idea that it's not very high.
It probably varies massively on where you are, though. In fairness, I mean, I don't think you can generalize in that way.
No, I'm not. I'm not gonna generalize either. It's just that I feel like, you know, there's something to be said about, you know, there's something to be said about prejudice in still modern society, where we haven't completely shaken this off.
Oh, I agree. That's
why it's
we're not sitting here better than people in medieval times learning all the art. We already have the answers, right? We have our own issues to deal with. And that's why it's so interesting, because they're on the way to, you know, going through the process that we are, you know, at the end of. They are basically, you know, going through recognizing how, you know, how empathy works, basically, for people who are different opinion, you know. And yeah, we are sort of, you know, we are sort of more at ease. They are on the way to the Enlightenment period, because Renaissance was a big. I mean, it wasn't it wasn't that much of a step forward, but it still was. Some things changed. And I love how you feel in this movie that different countries are at different stages of that process of discovering empathy. So, you know, when de la Mole flees to Amsterdam, you see that that's already a more advanced. I mean, it's a Protestant stronghold as well, but in a sense, there is this concept that it's a place where different religious groups can come together. And, you know, there's the character we're coming up to. He's actually Jewish, but he's willing to back the Protestants because he's willing to back religious freedom.
Yes.
So this which is an incredibly modern concept, and I love the fact that, you know, different parts of Europe are moving at their own speeds, and that of course also causes dynastic conflict, depending.
Which
on
is why I think it's important to watch films like this, because I mean, it tells you about a certain stage in the historical development of one country, but you cannot necessarily go and take a lesson from it that every country in that time period was at the same stage. They were all developing at different speeds, and they had different traditions and customs and ways of thinking about things, and that's why I think it's much more interesting to sort of look at films about French history from French and Italian perspective, because there was always a different way of looking at things from the inside and from the outside, right? Absolutely. If a German director makes a film about American history, you would probably feel that there's an emphasis on other things than you would probably find in an American director, because they are much more inside of the cultural mindset, and they're much more probably they have a deeper knowledge probably of what American history would be about. And in this case, I feel like it's sad that we don't have many international hits like this one about these topics, because making films about medieval periods is incredibly costly and difficult. And you are lucky if you get one good out of 10 usually, because you get like, I don't know, Robin Hood by Ridley Scott and all that stuff, which is I don't know.
But I think in a way it tends to, in England maybe, you do get dramas like this, but they tend to be more in the format of the miniseries. So when we have like explorations of the Anarchy or the War of the Roses, it tends to be long form, and this is already a very long film, right? And it's just focusing on one very small part of the story of the wars of religion in France. So I wonder if it does suit the mini series or the series better.
And I wonder now, because there's a film from 1954, also an adaptation of Dumas' book, which I haven't seen, so I don't know exactly what the outlook on this whole event would be in that film. Whether it would be much more straightforward, more of a black and white issue, or whether this would, because this seems a very nuanced attempt to look at things, whereas I don't know exactly if the older version would probably look at it from a different perspective. So it depends also on the time in which the film was made.
Agreed. It'd be interesting to find that. I haven't been able to get a copy, not even, online. And but what I do want to do, because it's a long time, I want to read the Dumas novel. Yeah. I've never read it, but I've read the journals of the real Reine Margot. But I should probably read the novel as well, because of course that's already a historic perspective, because these events are 1572, and that novel wasn't written until the 1840s. So that was already, in, I guess, the Third Republic. My French history knowledge is so bad. But
yeah, I'm not. I know about the Ancien Régime and Divine Right and all that stuff. We did from Louis XIV until
Yeah, and Napoleon tends to be featured quite.
Yeah,
in quite
those
way.
things. French Revolution, all that stuff is where I think I'm much stronger. And there's there's also, you talked about miniseries. I guess I'm not aware of many French miniseries about French history, but I know of one that talks in detail about the French Revolution, in detail and all that stuff, and also very nuanced picture. It's so nuanced that many people didn't know how to think about it. But yeah.
But I think the concept of someone in 1840s. So you've had the revolution and the discreditation of the monarchy, and then you've had the Code Napoleon, so this very kind of logical, liberal-minded constitution. But then you've also had the reintroduction of the monarchy. So how do you then, as an author, depict the monarchy? And obviously, Dumas, because he's a sensationalist writer, has gone very much for, the high melodrama. But it's also a political statement, isn't it? What he's saying is that in the era of the monarchy, you had these awful religious wars that gripped the country. And at least now, technically, we should be under some constitutional arrangement, the Code Napoleon, which should be better for minority rights. It should be, kind of everyone's equal under the law. This is a very radical new concept. So all of these interpretations are of their time and are of their social context, and I guess have a point that they're trying to make.
And it's also interesting to see that he's very much, he has these religious conflicts in many of his novels. I mean, in Three Musketeers, there's a whole at least the whole Buckingham situation and all that stuff. It's all about basically religion is everywhere.
And isn't one of the Musketeers a Jesuit or the head of the Jesuit order? Ultimately, right? So
yes.
So you don't get more religious than that.
But yeah, here, I mean, we sort of missed out on the brain dissection scene, but yeah, just so you know that there was a brain dissected somewhere, and it was visible and it was singular, because I don't know if you would have people look at that in a different production. But it always amazes me. Like I maybe I'm biased because I tend to root for international European productions, because I know that American film studios have so much more means at their disposal that it's like rooting for the underdog somewhere. And so whenever they do something that's out there, it's like you sort of feel like, would I see something like this in a different film, made by a huge big studio that aims for mainstream success? And I honestly don't know. Like, the PG-13 rating is something that I feel is somewhat useful, but most of the time it hurts.
I couldn't agree more. And when it comes to the brain dissection, I mean, I think of all the things that you should remove from this film, that is a pivotal scene. You've got to understand how obsessed Catherine de Medici is with prophecy and with the bloody mechanics of death. Because if you don't understand that, you don't understand why she commissioned the assassination of Coligny, and why she engineered the massacre, and why she then goes on to commission, poisonings that we're now going to see with Charlotte de Sauve. Like, you've got to understand the it's like watching Macbeth and not seeing the Three Witches. You've got to understand the deeply supernatural motivation, or the perception of a supernatural motivation here. And that's what gives its passion, this thing, that you're in this world that's almost quite modern with a sexual liberation, whatever, but at the bottom of it is something deeply pagan and deeply, these wars of religion, but underneath there's something very, very close to sort of...
mysticism.
Absolutely.
Which is always something that I find really interesting, to see the roots, it's like it puts you at the remove to a certain. I mean, there's a distance between you and them, but at the same time, it shows us that there is a motivation for these people to act like the way they do, because they believe in these supernatural things to a certain extent, and it's actually something that people honestly believe, and we know that out of those beliefs they did sometimes good and sometimes horrible things to other people. Witch burnings and all that stuff is all very much related to this, but they are more and more related to the 16th, 17th century. But at the same time, I feel like this is a powerful motivating tool. I mean, it's certainly a tool for her in this circumstance, but it's also something that she honestly believes. So it's not something that she just uses to her advantage. It's something that she feels has some kind of significance beyond herself.
Absolutely. Like, she does it in this bizarre, twisted way. She's doing it for the good of her family. But what I find amazing is, so obviously she's going to decide to poison Henri de Navarre by the means of Charlotte de Sauve's lips.
Yeah.
But the sacrificing Charlotte de Sauve, who, after all, is an aristocratic woman, she doesn't see any reason not to do this. By any means necessary. But I suppose when you've massacred, whatever it was, 5,000 Protestants, then what's a Catholic noblewoman in a way?
Which, if we are going to go if we're going to go back to our analogy to A Song of Ice and Fire, this is very much a Tywin Lannister-esque move to sort of do it in a way that is very much unknowable, or very much difficult to discover, and it's efficient. And but even though this here seems definitely to leave a big mess, but at the same time you don't know who's responsible, and sadly it also goes back.
But cui bono? I mean, come on. If she was really to have killed Henri de Navarre by this method, I think everyone would pretty much have figured it out.
No, that's true. Yeah, she doesn't come out looking good in any way. So, but yeah, here it's it's also something that we sort of, when we look back at the beginning of the film, like Margot doesn't actually want him around in any fashion. She doesn't approve of his presence, even on their wedding night, and so now she saved his life and she wants to comfort him, and so it's a definite progression. So.
Do you think she has genuine feelings for him here, or do you think her decision to consummate the marriage is more about, again, protection? Like, ultimately, it's going to be harder for them to annul this marriage or get rid of him if she makes it known that she has slept with him.
I think this is more probably more of a redemption, a general redemption for what has been done, right? She sort of tries to help him out of maybe a feeling of guilt over what happened, for and that's probably, I mean, I don't know that she cares so much about him as a person, but she definitely recognizes that there is a pain that is definitely real, and so she recognizes that he has to sort of, I mean, that he hasn't done anything. I mean,
and he seems to have had genuine feelings for Charlotte de Sauve, right? I mean, he does seem, okay, he's shocked at her death and fearful for his life, but I do feel there is a sort of a kernel of genuine, he's genuinely grieving for Charlotte, and therefore Margot is genuinely comforting him in that moment.
Yeah, and I think it's, because now they're kissing when at the beginning they wouldn't, even look at each other. Which is also really, I mean, it's also nice to see that they're warming up to each other, which is also something that, I mean, I don't believe in love at first sight usually either. It's like just something, this is like a Catelyn Stark, Ned Stark situation where you're wed off to someone you don't know, and over the time you get to know them better and you understand them and you appreciate their company, and yeah, that's what it's about.
So if an arranged marriage works out well, this is basically the means by which it happens, right? A slow respect and companionship, and yeah.
Which is why I felt, I mean, this is how I felt, reading Catelyn in the books. So it's, I mean, I don't have a problem as much with her on the TV show, because I feel like this is what I always, I mean, I wanted to see the more positive aspects to a character, and so, this is one thing that I found really interesting, that she sort of wed Ned, and that they came to love each other, over time, even though she was clearly in love with his older brother. And yeah, I see something similar happening here, even though, as we said earlier, Margot will definitely be imprisoned for a couple of years.
Absolutely. And I think it's almost like sort of, that's why you can have her being in love with the Comte de la Mole and also with Henri de Navarre almost simultaneously, because it's a totally different type of love. Love for Henri de Navarre is one of intellectual respect and sort of being in it together against the people who hate them, and genuine pity and sympathy, whereas the love for the Comte de la Mole is much more about the lust, the kind of the physical love, but also the symbolic way in which she represents something that she can protect, and it's like something she can have away from her family. But in a sense, it never felt weird to me that she could simultaneously be in love with both, I think, but in very different ways.
And so now they're reconciling. The guy that he previously stabbed in the head.
Coconut and de la Mole. I mean, that's a bromance, isn't it? That's a road movie just waiting to happen.
And it's really something I feel like this is sort of, again, we see more male nudity than we would probably see anywhere else. And I guess it also lies at the center, even though even though La Mole is not really, he's a much more important character than the other guy. But I feel that this is also something that is not there without a reason. I think. It shortly follows the scene between Margot and her husband, and these two reconciling. It's like this is the moment of realization and of truth, basically, that they are not different from each other. They have an equally valid belief that differs from each other, and they are recognizing it, and they are, at least aware that they're not from a different planet. So that's why I come down on it.
I love the fact that, and then you realize that he's Henriette's kept man. That's brilliant.
Yeah. So now,
I fully believe that Henriette would be capable of sleeping with either of these guys. On a whim.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, she seems to be like the adventurous type. So probably she just doesn't really care. It's just as men are using women at least in a very chauvinistic society, she's doing the same thing with them, because she knows that she puts herself out there, and she's also a very singular character in the film, which I find also refreshing, because usually you have a character like this sticking to one specific personality, and she's constantly changing. She's a complex character.
Definitely, and in real life as in the film, and therefore incredibly enigmatic. She's one of those historical women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who I can just read endlessly about. I just find them utterly fascinating. And I'm amazed there aren't more depictions of her.
Yeah, and I wish that, some of these secondary characters in this film would probably be very interesting main characters in their own film, right? I would say. If you gave them a perspective, if you gave them, like, a chance to be main characters.
So who would you love to see, of these characters? Who would be the spin-off movie you'd like to see?
Oh, definitely of the King. I think the King is probably... he's not the main character. He's not the main character. He's just... Margot is the main character. He's one of the supporting cast. And he got nominated for supporting cast as well, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So he's... I feel like... But then again, it's always royalty. I don't like the fact that, whenever you have historical dramas, it's always about, people in an authority, or most of the time, let's say. Maybe Henriette would probably be the character that I would be interested in.
I'd love to see, like, in the alternate fiction version of this, the sort of the Coconut and de la Mole go riding through. But I'd love to see almost like the teen version of this, so where you see what exactly did happen with Margot. Who did she lose her virginity to? Was the brother once healthier, and can we see him less deteriorated? And also just the relationship between... I would have loved to have seen the relationship between the mum, Catherine de Medici, and her husband. Like, did she manipulate him, or was he actually a strong king, and then when he died it all went horribly wrong? So many questions.
Yeah. And it's a shame that, we are focusing so much on the love affair in this film, because I feel like this film would have probably benefited from focusing more on the I feel like it's like, you've seen the Last Mohican by Michael Mann, right?
Oh yes, I have. Yeah.
It's sort of, I feel about this film kind of like I feel about that one, even though I love both of them. I feel like the love story in both of them is a bit hokey, or it's not hokey, but it's
definitely
it's a bit simple, and it sort of takes away from the context that is much more interesting.
Yeah, sometimes I wish people would just have the confidence to let the politics and history speak for itself and not have to tack on a romance. And in a way, maybe that's why we like Song of Ice and Fire, because there have been romances through it, but there's no real sort of romantic hero and heroine at this point, right? I mean, there's no one you're rooting for as the star-crossed lovers.
Oh yeah, Lord of the Rings, but even then you can say, Sam and Frodo, they definitely look at each other in a good way.
Yeah, but I mean, like, not talking about the films, but the actual book. I mean, in the films, of course, they amp up the sort of the Arwen Aragorn stuff, but it's not about that in the books at all.
No, of course not. I mean, I would, and I feel it's a shame when people reduce it to that as well. I mean, in any case.
So speaking of which, did you watch The Hobbit, just to go off topic a little bit?
Oh, the third one?
Yes.
No, I haven't seen it yet. I want to see it, though, because I feel like, I've been through the first two, and I ought to see the last one, just, for completionist's sake, because I am a big fan of that world, and I think the fact that, there's probably too much passion for the material from Peter Jackson, so much so that he probably would have. He's probably too reverential of the material, but
too reverential. Wow, because I think a lot of people would say the opposite.
I think he wants to do everything justice. He wants to tackle everything that's in the appendices, everything that is in the extended.
I see what you mean. That's sort of greed.
Yeah, he doesn't want to leave anything out. He wants to probably explore all those facets, right? And he doesn't manage it quite in The Hobbit. So because probably the fact that they already know that they are good at it is a problem. They already they know that they have 3 huge successes with the previous 3 films, and so that was probably a big problem for them to find their way back, because it's been so long, and it's been I mean, people usually change their perspective on things and their way to approach adaptations and all that stuff, and I feel like the way that he's trying to get everything from the book in and add his own stuff on top of it to make it his own, I think that's a big problem. But at the same time, I don't think it's all on him, because it was a corporate decision to split the film into 3, the series into 3 films, and so when the studio says, you make 3 films or we don't fund you, then if you want to make the film, then you're going to have to do as the studio says. So I don't blame him entirely for it. But this is a scene which I find really impressive. Here, where they are all on their horses going to ride out, which we would have liked to have seen in season 1 of Game of Thrones.
It's just beautiful, isn't it? And they're all in their, like, the royal party is all in their turquoise cloaks. There's just something beautiful, and again, I think this is coming back to Patrice Chereau's theatre and opera background, of the way he stages this and the movement. It's so kinetic, and he also has staged dance productions, and there's just something balletic about this.
And that, I mean, at least I've I listen to Steve Attewell sometimes talk about the show, and they talked about the Stannis scene at the end of season 4, where they said the horses, basically, you could get horses to be that, to ride in that precise formation if you train them well enough. And this makes me think that this is actually possible, because they are, lined up all in one row, and then they're going after it. And this is where I think the second comparison between a Robert from A Song of Ice and Fire and King Charles IX comes in.
Oh, being mauled in a hunt.
Like, he's sort of the Robert Baratheon, because he likes hunting, and because he wrote a book about hunting, and because that was apparently what he was good at, observing all these different things about hounds and all that stuff. So
I mean, did they shoot this they must have shot this with a live wild boar, but the stabbing is so. Yeah, and of course the Australian friend I watched this with whom I was translating the film, because she didn't speak French, is also a militant vegetarian, right? So
yeah,
it was like it was like the single most unsuitable film for me to make her watch.
But I don't think that they actually hurt the boar.
No, but it's just so realistic the way in which it's shot. And it must be right, because you've got to feel that the king is in genuine peril. and you've got to realize that the brother did nothing and that Henri chose to save him at the risk of his own life.
Because they felt he was a liability at this point. So, yeah.
Like, if you don't believe that the king was in peril, then you don't understand the debt that Charles then feels to Henri, and therefore why Henri feels when he says to Margot, but the king owes me a favour, he's not going to do anything to me, and she's like, don't be stupid, he changes from day to day.
Yeah.
But you've got to believe that this wild boar hunt is absolutely like the nuclear option of hunting at this point, I guess.
Yeah, it's actually, it's very difficult to, because boars are really, they're really ferocious. I know about a boar because I lived near forest in Munich for a while when I was like 12.
Oh, okay, cool.
And there was always a boar that people would feed at the entrance of the park, right, of the woods. And at some point I heard that it got so used to being fed that when it didn't receive anything to eat, it would like chase people. And at some point someone was chased up a tree because it was so out of control. And it's that sort of thing. It's these animals can be really ferocious, and so I definitely if it's a big boar like this one, you could probably see it happening. And I guess something that contributes to the peril in the situation is the music as well. The soundtrack I actually own, and it's really unique.
This is interesting because I love the soundtrack, and I was trying to buy it on iTunes today, and it wasn't available to purchase. So
I found it in my local DVD store.
No way! That's so cool.
Yeah.
So it was issued, because I was wondering if it had even been released as a soundtrack, because I found lots of albums by the composer which had 1 or 2 tracks from their film on them, like compilations of other movie scores that he's done. And I was thinking, well, maybe they didn't release the soundtrack because it's a fairly small film and not all soundtracks get released. But that gives me hope that I can go on the hunt now. But you're right, the music
you
is...
can probably find it on Amazon, probably. But
it's kind of medieval, and then it has this amazing kind of like ethnic choral aspect to it.
Yeah,
then they have synthesizer stuff. Like, it has a modern, especially the hunt scene, right? It has this deep grinding sort of, I don't know how to describe it. I'm bad at describing music, but... And
they have Ofra Haza singing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I always love, especially the past few things on this, which is the end credits song, which I find really interesting. It's. She was also she also sang the beginning for the Prince of Egypt, which is one of the best scenes in the whole film. So I think the soundtrack definitely adds to the mood of the whole thing, and makes you feel like you are in that place, in that time, because you have. I think the wedding music is on there too. It's like, people chanting and all that stuff. It's really interesting.
And again, I think it's so clever to have people like Ofra Haza and some of the kind of the ethnic folk melodies he brings in and the instruments, and then you have the very austere sort of Catholic choral work, and all these different influences again kind of match, like what I was saying before about this very kind of religious world, Catholic versus Protestant, and yet you have these very pagan things underneath, and you just see through the music this richness, these layers of the influences at that time, that it's not black and white, it's not simple, that there's all sorts of currents in this world at this point of great change.
Yeah. And here the king visibly paranoid, I would say. Probably he is at this point as well, because he's been wounded, and
he's not paranoid, is he? He watched his brother prevent people save his life. So
that's probably
rightfully paranoid, I think.
Anymore as well, right? So he's got to see his sister at some, and then that's why probably he forgives her later on. And
so in real life, Charles had a wife and a legitimate child.
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't know that much. I know what he said in connection to the massacre and the general situation, but sadly I haven't read about his his love life and his legacy.
because I think his brother his brother Henry III becomes the king after him when he dies. So
Okay, I just jumped on Wikipedia, so if that's correct, apparently he did father an illegitimate child with his
okay.
mistress. So, yeah, I'm not sure if she was as peasanty and hidden as this, or whether she was more like a court mistress, but yeah, he did have a son.
Oh, yeah, that's him. Yeah.
I always find that scene where they go to the mistress quite touching. Just two men having a simple meal and talking about their families.
Yeah, and then she sort of, because she doesn't know who the other guy is, so I suspect. So, but yeah, it also makes the king more relatable, right? Because it makes him more complex as a character as well to show this. Because
I think it's important for us to see that the king has something worthy to him. Otherwise, we're not going to. They need to make us. We've just seen him be this very weak, vacillating, cruel guy, and we need to have some sympathy for him if we're going to then see the tragedy of what comes later, right?
Yeah. So. Even though, and that's probably just me. I have a lot of empathy. Even when you have unlikable characters, really unlikable characters, I would probably be the one to go, well, there's something off screen that we're not aware of, and so it's difficult for me to judge them, in the moment in time that we are focusing on. So if the king here in this situation weren't given this scene, I would probably still go, well, this is a more complex situation, and these are people who lead everyday lives like you and me, who have different interests like you and me, and so I can probably empathize on that level still with them, even though they might do really horrible acts, because I know that they're in their own mind they're doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah, I agree. But it is nice here to see him very much lead that everyday life, and just have a moment of quiet, because we've had the massacre, and then we've had the hunting scene almost back. So you've had the massacre, the Charlotte de Sauve murder, and then you've had the hunting scene. So in a way, it's almost nice just to take a moment of calm, just to see, the two men having dinner with the kid, and then just to see the two lovers just take 5 minutes to just be in their company, and as we rev up for the final act of the film. I think it makes a lot of in sort of terms of dramatic construction of the screenwriter. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and he's trying to convince the king to let him take Margot with him to Navarra, right? So
the king was not going to let Margot go.
No, because and you have this sort of that's also this sort of Robert Aaron, which I should say, Robert Aaron face, sort of like this sort of childlike grinning, like mischievous, where he sort of knows what's up, and he doesn't want to let go because that's what he wants, and that's why he doesn't.
Although I also get the impression with Charles that it's not about power. It's not. He doesn't want to not let Margot go because she's an important political pawn. It's a genuine. She's my plaything. I love her. She's my sister. You don't get to have her.
But that's also how Robert Aaron treats Sansa, right? At the same time.
Absolutely.
Elaine, I should say, Elaine. But yeah, half bland couple. I feel he's not as good a character as the others are.
What, to them all?
Yeah, he's meant to be the sort of he's the lover, right? He's that character. But yeah, he's also a victim in this case of violence, and so it's more complicated. But at the same time, I think in this scene it seems there's less of a, I don't know. He just doesn't feel like as complex as the two other characters we just left. So I would rather have spent a bit more time with them. But I like, at least people get to see a steamy sex scene, which I would probably say, if you have seen to people who are listening to the recording later, if people haven't seen the film, this film is not yet rated. it
Oh,
shows you
isn't it?
exactly.
Oh, sorry. You mean the actual documentary? The film was not
Yes,
narrated,
yes.
yeah.
It shows you exactly what you can show. Oh, and we even get to see the penis, which you wouldn't see in probably American TV either, because people are probably ashamed of showing it. Men are not comfortable watching it. I don't know. It's just very to me as a European, it seems very very natural. It's just sort of a part of your body, whatever. Like
Yeah.
what's for breakfast?
I agree. I always find it quite odd. But anyway, we return to court,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I love the scene because it's just so uncomfortable. Because of course, Catherine de Medici, who loves her son, has to thank Henri de Navarre, who she hates, for saving him.
Yeah.
But it's the most uncomfortable embrace and thanks you'll ever see in cinema.
And here we have them walking in the courtyard. Two of them are in red, two of them are in grey or something, one of them is in blue. I feel like this has to be some kind of...
Colour coding, for sure.
Yeah.
But, Virna
This-
Lisi, her acting is so good because there's no difference in her makeup here when we see her, and yet she looks so aged. It's like all of this plotting she's like the portrait of Dorian Gray. Like, it's all physically manifest in her face, and as we now progress into the final act of this movie, she's just going to look more and more beaten and haggard, and like it's this evil is taking a physical toll on her in a way.
Yeah.
This obsession that she's allowed to overcome her about prophecy and about making sure her succession is complete.
And then he sees the blood on the wall.
I mean, it's almost tragedy. You could actually play this whole film from the point of view of Catherine de Medici as a tragedy, as a Shakespearean tragedy, like Macbeth.
And it would be probably, I mean, it's always that's what I mean when we talk about people who are fairly unlikable. I can still empathize with her fear. Let's say the fear of her situation. I
Absolutely.
could probably see the paranoia and the trepidation as to the consequences of of a Huguenot uprising or something. It's like something that is very, it's very human, and it's something you would say a person like her would be willing to kill for, to prevent, but at the same time she's doing it with more killing. So
I mean, what can I say? I've always had a soft spot for Cersei, or a lot of
no, I
empathy.
do
Like I just feel that she gets a hard time, and I can really understand how someone frustrated with women's position in society, frustrated with her relationship with her father, desperate for the succession of her sons, and
afraid of her brother.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally. I have a lot of time for Cersei, whatever that says about
I
me.
do too, and it's. But at the same time, I still go. But if you would just leave everything like behind, and live the simpler life, you probably wouldn't have to be as paranoid as you are. That's how I see it. Just leave everything, just get out and see discover the world or something like that. That would probably be the best solution to this, because otherwise she's just gonna self-destruct. And I feel like getting a time off would be a good thing. And so here we have him leave the room, so it's again conflict.
Apparently, the actor who plays the youngest son, who is about to take a poisoned book for Henri de Navarre. Apparently, that actor went on in real life to date Marion Cotillard, but he had this horrible accident, and he ended up a paraplegic and committed suicide at a very young age. So it's a tremendously sad story in real life.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, that's also something, like, most of these actors are probably not known to Americans or to, people outside of France. I mean, some of these side characters are probably not that well known to them. And so it's always like interesting. I mean, I that's usually why I try to watch a lot of films from all over the world because I feel like there are so many different actors that I like to that I don't know of, and if I find them interesting, I'd like to see what else they've done. And so here, at least the actors who play the royal family are all very good in their roles. So it's always a bit of a shame that unless you watch this film, you're not going to experience. You're not going to be aware necessarily of what they're doing with their career. And she passed away recently, right?
Yes, she did. She did.
In December, which is sad. Because outside of this film, I'm sad to say I haven't seen her in anything else. But she had a career in Hollywood for a short time, I think, right? In the early 70s?
Yeah, but I mean, I have to say, I think with a lot of these actors, and again, coming back to Patrice Chereau's background in theatre and opera, weren't necessarily, even in their own countries, film actors. So, for instance, the amazing actress who I love is Henriette Nevers. She had has an amazing theatre career and has done very few films. She's just not an actress who felt she wanted or needed to do that. So, I mean, of course, there are people like Daniel Auteil, Jean-Hugues, who obviously have incredibly famous in France. But a lot of these actors just weren't. I guess Isabelle Adjani would have been known at the time in Hollywood. I mean, she did. She was kind of like a paparazzi favorite as well with her relationships as well. So.
And the weirdest thing is, when first I watched the film, I thought, well, I know the actress who plays Margot from something else. And I thought, well, maybe she was in one of the brides in Bram Stoker's Dracula, maybe, with Gary Oldman. And then I found out, no, it was actually Monica Bellucci who played her. And it's like,
a quite similar look, though, no? With the very full lips and the beautiful eyes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, yeah.
Some of these people, yeah, that's why I think like she looks like, the French Monica Bellucci, probably. I don't know. And here we have the king, again, reading his book. And he very notably licks his finger, touches the pages. Yeah. And the youngest son is not happy about it. I mean, someone, offensive.
I mean, he just looks on, it's almost like he's frozen in shock, like, what do I do with this? I can't tell him to stop, because if I tell him to stop, I'm going to be implicated in the poisoning plot.
Yes.
And I guess, probably at some level, he's thinking, well, I'm going to be one place closer to the throne. And of course he did sit atop the throne.
But he's the youngest one, so he wouldn't probably inherit anything.
But I don't know, because they all have kingdoms, right? Because the next in line is about to be sent to be king of Poland, so there's other territories other than France you can inherit. Oh, I hate the next scene where we have him sort of kissing his mother in this slightly too familiar way.
Yeah. But at least everyone else is having a nice party.
And the rather sly way. I mean, Charles IX, even in his enfeebled state, has this classic line where he says, "Now everybody's a king. I'm king of France. Henri's king of Navarre, and you're king of Poland." But obviously, it's meant to be seen that Poland is the shittier option of those three.
Yeah. Well.
No offense to the Polish, but there's very much that implication from Charles that he's really needling his brother.
Yeah, here. But at the same time, like he's crying here. So it's like he's a. These are all three-dimensional human beings, and I can't say that enough. And probably you're bored. People who are listening to this are probably bored by me saying this, but yeah.
No, but it's a really good point to keep making, because after all, the material is high melodrama. I mean, it's incest, it's poisonings, it's massive conspiratorial plots. It would have been incredibly easy for these people to be sort of caricatures or pantomime villains, and here you have a scene where the brothers are manhandling their sister, lifting up her skirts to show that they fucked her. I mean, it could be just really lacking in any kind of emotional depth or subtlety, and yet despite all these really bizarre scenes, these are, like you say, fully fleshed characters. So yeah, absolutely, I think you're completely right to emphasize that.
And here, I mean, definitely he's wearing his cross around the neck, right? 2 crosses, I think. So it's like, very, even 3. It's astonishing.
No, it's actually also important that they have they have a discussion here, and she obviously can't. I mean, Margot can't interject, which is always sad. So yeah.
I always felt that the scene where they try and shame Margot and lift up her skirts and they're kind of attacking her, all these men, was a kind of a rape. I mean, it's not a rape because they're not going to rape her, right? But just this kind of, it's a real violation. It's a real physical, sexual violation here.
Sort of something that, I mean, the character who has been sort of trying to compromise is not, you know, in a she's not tolerated in any way here, and so they try to I don't know, they're definitely, I mean, it's definitely a violation of her body in some way, I think.
Yeah.
And the king is sort of a bit, I mean, I don't know, he's also not shocked or anything. He's just sort of observing what's happening here.
But then he does have a kind of a fit.
He has a fit. Yeah.
So, but again, it's so impotent in a way. Like, he can't really stop it, but he does stop it because by having a fit, everyone's shocked at his reaction, and then that kind of saves her. But I guess in a way also, like, I always thought with that fit, was that the violent reaction to Margot? Or was it just like, you know, it's the poison starting to attack his stomach at this point, right? So he's probably just having wild pain.
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, it's probably a bit of both.
Yep.
But at the same time, I feel like he's probably much more concerned about, I mean, at least in this moment, because he just so abruptly, you know, turns his back on everyone here. I think he's not as concerned about her at this moment, so it's probably much more the poison kicking in, and just maybe just his natural. I mean, we know that he was in a state of physical deterioration anyway, so it's probably more this, and so I won't go as far as to say, well, he deliberately he's sort of just pretending to have a fit in order to save her from humiliation. So I won't go to say that. It's probably just, you know.
And then we come into the scene, the final sort of hammer in the coffin for my poor Australian vegetarian dog-loving friend.
Oh yeah.
The death of Auteil didn't go down at all well.
Do you find it? I mean, just in general, like, there are people I know who genuinely feel that they don't like to watch something when an innocent animal is hurt or killed. It's like, you know, it's why Boomer and Independence Day continues to live. I mean, spoiler. But I feel that it's important because this is something that he has a deep connection to, right? He sort of considers this a true companion, and we see him breaking down here. I
mean, I think it's a sad scene because, you know, Axion is more than just Dr. Emmett's loyalty, it's unconditional love, which he doesn't get from his family, and it's also, you know, his love of the chase. But I mean, the dramatic irony of the fact that he takes the dog back to the very man who made the poison.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just horrible, this scene. I hate this scene. I'm not a particular dog lover, but
at the same time, though, I feel that, you know, there are people who say the Game of Thrones episode, The Reigns of Castamere, I mean, there's some people who haven't read the books, obviously, who said that, you know, they're killing the wife and the wolf, and you know, those are the two rules on TV that you do not break. You don't kill a pregnant woman, and you don't kill
well, I don't think there should be any rules in TV or film.
No, of course.
All bets are off, right?
But at the same time, I feel like, you know, people arbitrarily react to this kind of thing. They can see human beings being, you know, mutilated and killed in droves, right? But they can't watch a dog die. You know, it's like there's a way in which entertainment sort of wants to make you feel fine with everything, where you don't see the
the really ugly stuff where you just shove it onto, Discovery Channel and late night TV where no one's watching, and it's like as if it didn't exist. And so I feel like when animals die, it's always sad because you think they're innocent creatures who don't have a clear conception of what is happening to them, right? And so it feels like an injustice. But here it's meant to feel as an injustice because the king obviously cares about the dog, right? And so it's meant to be sort of his realization that he's sort of the target of some conspiracy. And yeah, if people say, well, I'll stop watching at this point, I would say that this is a bit of an arbitrary decision because it's still it's still a part of the film that has its place. So
no, I completely agree, and I think that this comes back to what we were talking about before about attitudes towards showing sex on screen, and all the stuff that's discussed in the film is not yet rated, where somehow you can show sex on screen. It's much better if you show violence if you're an American than sex. But if you do show sex, then God forbid you show a woman
pubic
being
hair.
Pleasured.
Yeah, or pubic hair. Anti-pubic hair. And now the second hunt scene. And it's important that the king is in red, I think. Especially considering what happens after.
But this hunt scene is entirely orchestrated by the king to give Henri de Navarre another chance to escape, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so he's a bit, but he's, at the same time, he's wearing a red shirt. He's literally a red shirt, and now he's literally bleeding from the face. So, yeah, it's, are you still on his Wikipedia page? Because I know that he had, it says on somewhere that what his ailment was, I think in the later section. But I
just
don't
look
remember.
it up. Charlemagne of France. Apparently it was tuberculosis.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But
deteriorating to the point where by the spring of 1574 his hoarse coughing turned bloody and his hemorrhages grew more violent.
Makes sense. But I don't know. Do you bleed? Out of the pores of?
No, I don't. Well, what do I know? I'm not a medic.
This is probably poison. This is probably the poison or something.
Yeah, exactly. Which I guess is arsenic poisoning.
Could be, yeah. It's not like it's not like the Strangler where you just bleed out of your nose and your ears, but like Joffrey on the show. But it's I guess.
Yeah.
But here's also a very, very humane moment for her. Because we know that she's clearly not, she's not comfortable with this situation. Even though it's clear that she favors her, she'd rather have the other son on the in power.
But nonetheless, when she sees her first son dying horribly, I think there's genuine regret and genuine maternal strife. I think she'd rather her second son be on the throne, but she didn't want to sacrifice her eldest son like this. Yeah.
And yeah, so it's also because there are sections in the film where Marguerite de Valois is actually not. There are long sections. I want to say where she is not the focus, and so it's
Absolutely.
like you don't, which might also be why Roger Ebert gave it such a harsh review, because it doesn't feel like there's one main character necessarily. Throughout the film, because all these other characters have their moments.
And in a sense, she's also not an agent of the action in many ways.
No.
Her mother does more. Both kings kind of do more in a way. She's sexually like an agent, but not really in other ways. And in a way, it's about just her reaction and her coming to empathy through what she sees. So you're right. She's, in a sense, she's she's a reactor rather than an actor. But
And I like the fact that they tried to make her at least as active as possible by, having her try to reason with her husband and try to protect him and protect her paramour, or her lover, if you want to call it that. And so it's like, she did what she was able to do, given the circumstances of her. And so now, I always forget why they're celebrating here. It's just like there's a section of the film where I don't know exactly why he's so happy at this point. Is it because they just divorced, or what was it?
I'm not sure.
I feel like it's something. I mean, it's probably something really important, but it's like there's this scene where we never really know why they're so happy. No, it's...
Yeah, it's slightly bizarre. But anyway, we're now coming into the denouement of the movie, which is, I guess, played as high melodrama and tragedy, right?
Yeah, so they're talking now. He's saying that he sort of backs Margot, right?
Yep. Super. So, listeners, if you see a little bit of a cut in the conversation, we had another call drop, but we're back in business at 1:59. So, on with the show.
We're getting through with this.
Yeah, exactly. We're nearly there. I mean, we're really in the final end game now.
Yeah, only about 20 minutes left. Yeah. I just a question in general, because I heard that there was at least with one of the DVD commentaries there was a problem with copyright because some of the film was audible. I hope that this is not the case here.
Oh no, well I can't hear anything from your end, so I think
I can hear like whispering, sort of like, because I turned down the volume considerably.
Okay, well I should be able to edit most of that up.
Yeah.
And then we get the final tragic scene of this film, which is it just
him getting axed.
Well, him getting axed, but then to me the emotional sort of when Margot goes to plead with the king.
Yeah, of course.
All dressed in virginal bridal white, which she didn't even wear on her wedding. As if to kind of appeal to his image of their relationship as children in a more pure time.
Yeah.
And the red blood on the white clothes. It's just beautiful.
Now we have the sword fight, basically. And the little boy comes a running. And Margot and... oh yeah, constant. Oh wow. That was rude.
When the first time I watched this, I have to say, rather superficially just obsessed with Margot's jewels in that scene. All the wonderful pearls and then these amazing hair combs, because I had really long hair at that time, so I just thought these jewels, these pearls in the hair and the diamond stars were just unbelievable.
Yeah. And here you sort of have basically also everyone has an emotional moment. She's been sort of stern the whole time, and so now
even Henriette is wants her to plead for their husbands or their lovers, I guess.
Yeah. And so now the king in what looks to be a church,
and looks horrific, right?
Yeah. I mean, he's cloaked in white, which makes him look much more like a corpse, I guess. And can barely move apparently. So,
but I guess also the symbol of purity and martyrdom and sacrifice, against, in sharp contrast, operatically to his mother, all cloaked in black as the sort of the scheming widow.
Yeah.
In the shadows, up on the balcony, away from everyone else, hiding in corners with her shame of what she's done to her son. Incredibly tragic.
Yeah. So now, King embraces other people. And so here
comes Marguerite all in white as well.
Yeah, with all the wonderful jewels.
Yeah. It's like this would be, the Princess Di move. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Some celebrity who's also royalty.
But I always think that in a way, when we first meet Margot, she's dressed all in red, incredibly proud. I mean, when you look at her, the body language in that scene at the marriage with her husband, who's trying to sort of ask her to make an alliance, she barely looks down at him because the ruff she's wearing is so stiff. It's almost like she physically can't lower herself to him. And yet here in this final scene, she falls to her knees and is begging. It's kind of like, how is the arrogant woman brought to her knees? And so it should be this very compromised position, and yet it's her at her strongest, her most empathetic. She has become fully, a fully realized, noble woman. It's quite beautiful, I think.
And obviously the importance of red on white, right? When he's bleeding on her dress and stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite a gothic film in a way, isn't it? There's a lot of blood. Yeah,
which is always interesting to me, at least, because this takes visual effects and all that stuff. People had to. This is before the age of overuse of CG, basically. So, I like it. Because especially red, like red is a really, really powerful color here, because they're both in white and they're both sort of in each other's arms here, trying to support each other, which is another symbolic gesture.
But also because it looks like real blood. I mean, you feel like he is sweating out his life in this blood, and it's probably the most realistic depiction I've ever seen of this kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's probably, you could also, if you were to look at it metaphorically, it goes also back to the massacre as well. It's everything is connected to that one fateful night here.
Absolutely.
Where it's basically his sins basically come back. They ooze out of him basically, even though he might not feel it. They're his sins at this point.
And it's all very fateful. I feel like we've gone from that sort of Christ-like imagery of Margot holding this very bloody body of the Comte de la Mole on the night of the massacre and saving him, so being covered in his blood and then being covered in her brother's blood. And it all comes full circle because, of course, the man who saved him from execution will ultimately execute Coconut and de la Mole. Like, there's a certain way in this kind of like this wheel of fate where it all comes back on itself.
Mm-hmm. Which is why, I like, the all stories that sort of talk about, the inevitability of fate and the how much free will do you have, how much awareness of your own liberty do you have, in those circumstances, and what are the consequences of this. This is all what I really like, and I think medieval contexts make it much more interesting to me, because I feel like today, you have the idea that everything sort of is interconnected to some extent. People from all over the world sort of getting together, and it's like, this is much more fragmented society. This is a class society. This is a religiously divided society, and people make choices based on those divisions. And here we probably focus on the perpetrators much more than we would in a different kind of movie, right? It's because they want to make these people understandable to us in some way. They want to still make them complex enough for us to invest time, in getting to understand them. And here the king is dying basically in his bed now, and he's talking about his God, my God, I come to you now. And we know in real life that, basically I think that he said, what will I tell God when I meet him,
Oh,
after
absolutely. I think this
he
is,
did.
he was deeply concerned with whether or not he had damned his soul.
Yes. And I think it's a very, I mean, those kinds of regrets, maybe, or I mean, those kinds of considerations. It is a very heavy film. I mean, it's not something like yay, sword wielding, big battles, big war scenes and everything. This is much more concerned with the human condition, I would say.
I completely agree. I mean, this is ultimately a very complex, nuanced story about, it's a character drama. It's a character-driven, emotion-driven, psychological drama, I think.
Yeah, and I think the cinematographic choices here help it enormously as well, because they help emphasize, also the color choices, everything, every visual element here is actually meant to reinforce the ideas within the film. And so, I mean, it's much easier to sort of see the ideas behind it. Even though, and I maintain this, even though one might have no knowledge of this period of history whatsoever, I mean, at some point, it's not even about the historical facts in this film. It's more about, how do people in that time period, in that specific place, react to this, and how do they conceive life in general, and I think that's actually much more interesting to me than just getting all the facts right necessarily.
I agree.
That's why I don't mind deviations from historical facts.
It's actually probably worth talking a little bit about the cinematography, which was by Philippe Rousselot, I think, from memory, but he's the guy who shot Dangerous Liaisons. He also shot...
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, he also shot a lot of kind of mid-period movies for Tim Burton, which I always thought was very appropriate, because I think Tim Burton's, again, this guy who creates these very visually striking worlds with very extreme color choices and, very carefully framed and staged, and you see a lot of that in this film. He also shot, I think, Interview with the Vampire, again, that very sort of gothic...
Yeah.
Creating this very kind of claustrophobic world of...
And it's sad to me, because this look of film, like, this is distinctly a film from... I always associate the look of these films with the 90s for some reason, because you have Bram Stoker's Dracula, you have Sleepy Hollow, you have all the other Tim Burton films around that time, and you have this and Dangerous Liaisons, as you mentioned, right? They all have there's a coldness to the visuals that actually says something about the mood of the story, and also about the ideas beneath the story, I would say. So it's very distinct in that, and I don't remember seeing this kind of visual aesthetic recently in films, because
I wonder if it's because, well, there could be two reasons. We could have just had less gothic films in the 2000s. It became less fashionable. Or it could be maybe the migration to digital video, because it's much harder to render those very deep, rich blacks with early stage DV. I mean, like, DV cameras have now moved on tremendously. But even then, I think a lot of cinematographers would admit that to get those rich, velvety blacks is still quite hard with DV.
And here we have Margot, Marguerite de Valois, in her coach.
This is Salome, isn't it? The kind of the kind of erotic objectification of the decapitated head of her lover.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful through history.
Which makes her much more like Lirio Miopatis, I think. Like, he gives the hand of his dead wife around, and she has the head of her dead lover.
Yeah. But I love this. I think it's again, it brings you to that sort of gnarly, sort of pagan, pre-Christian sort of, arms deep in blood and gore. I love it. I think it's so... like her brother would never let her go, and now she's going, and by God, she's going to take her lover with her, even if he's dead. It's unbelievable in a way.
Yeah, and it's also because, I mean, she had multiple lovers, didn't she? So at some point, yeah. So that I haven't, I don't know exactly what happened to her in that department afterwards, right? I mean, whether or not she took other.
Oh, she still had multiple lovers, but the problem was that she went off to Navarre, and in the period following, I mean, Henri de Navarre basically imprisoned her for 18 years, and she was just seen as too politically divisive, and also, after all, we see the scene earlier, don't we, when he renounces Catholicism and goes back to being Protestant, and you can almost see the kind of his Protestant supporters thinking, well, why would you not throw off your wife? But he doesn't. He keeps the marriage, which I think both of them throughout this movie put themselves on the line for each other, and it turns toxic in the way that the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to her English king also turned toxic, and she was imprisoned in a castle for a number of years. But I think with these dynastic marriages, that happens, right? Because the wife you marry, when she comes with a great title and house, comes with her own power, and that could be threatening to you.
Yeah, and this is actually, I feel, there's a case to be made that, women like Elizabeth I were, I mean, those are much more openly progressive, or at least self-affirming individuals. Like here, this is much more subdued, I think, in comparison. If we take that as an example, like as women who we consider to be out of their time, like very, very much further advanced in their way of thinking than the people around them. This is a different personality, I think, and so it bugs me, when you have a strong female character who always has to be like very harsh and very, I don't know, very authoritative, right? I mean, I think a strong female character is, in the end, a complex female character. That does not mean that the character has to hold a lot of power, but she has to be very nuanced to me in order to make it, a very, very complex portrayal of a woman in a film. Because most of the time in these kinds of films, you tend to they tend. I mean, I talked about Robin Hood earlier, right?
Yep.
And like Cate Blanchett in that film basically made Marion, wields a sword at the end, and that's sort of meant to be the sort of big liberating moment. So it's like, but it's always still.
It's so simplistic that the only way in which you can show power is martial power. So again, the woman, in order to look powerful, has to conform to the male paradigm at the time. It's incredibly patronizing in its own way.
It's always like, the women can only be considered strong women when they're doing what the boys are doing. That's what it comes down to, which I find it's patronizing in a different way. And so, as long as the character has a lot of different sides to her, it's actually, to me, that's more important. I mean, I don't need to see.
I agree.
Lots of sword wielding and big speechifying and all that stuff, which is why Elizabeth the Golden Age wasn't as good. But I feel that we have at least reached a point with fantasy where I feel like now, and that's also going back to what we said about The Hobbit. I think it's sad in a way that we have gone so far beyond what people would normally expect from a good fantasy movie, right? We have so much higher expectations now, with Game of Thrones being on TV and presenting all these different female characters. That so now when you have a character like Tauriel in the Hobbit films, it's sort of like we're saying, yeah, well, what else is there to that character? It's a bit weird. It's not
doing the female cause any service, is it, really?
Yeah, I admire the intent behind it, but I feel like we have high expectations now, and so it's a good effort, but it doesn't reach what the standards that we are now living by. I mean, it would have helped like in fantasy films of the 80s, I think, but yeah.
But the absurd thing is that this film that we've just been discussing is 20 years old.
Yes.
And it feels like that was far more advanced in its depiction of female power, the nuances of female power, in its depictions of the nuances of emotional and its ability to show sex and its ability to show violence and stuff that's 20 years later.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I mean, I admire this film immensely. I think it's just absolutely stunning. But I mean,
to me,
watching it now, it just feels like it's almost way ahead of anything that we have now. Almost, it's unbelievable.
Which is why I wouldn't knock older movies any time, because I feel like there's something to be learned. There are people who are much more progressive in their thinking, who are by that I mean who are ahead of their time, than people who we like to present today when we talk about people who are presenting these issues in a very nuanced way today. I think what is done today seems a bit more on the nose to me than what the film did 20 years ago, because it's so much part of the story that you don't even see it. You can see it if you want to see it there. It's actually it's part of the story, but without beating you over the head with the fact that it is doing this.
Absolutely.
Whereas you have films today that are sort of one issue films. They sort of have they have one good thing about them that people always mention because they are trying to challenge some kind of assumptions about a certain group of people or a certain issue, but they don't do everything that we just discussed in the nuance that we've just seen. So
indeed,
it's actually a bit sad that we have. I mean, because we always tend to feel that the further we go, the more complex and in depth we take these themes and these stories and the elements of them. But that's not always the case. Sometimes people tend to forget that the classics still have their place, and the old films still, in some cases, still overshadowed some of the new ones. So I hope that at least people will feel interested in watching a 2-hour 20-minute film. It's 2-hour.
And moreover, interested enough to then go back and listen to it with us rambling on in the background.
Oh yeah, that's probably.
But I just want to say, thank you to the listeners and to Mathieu for bearing with us with this 2.5 hours sort of revisit of Reine Margot, available widely on DVD in varying versions. I found this a really, really interesting show. I found it amazing to hear your insights. I think we agree on a lot of what makes this film special and unique. So hopefully if you have any other historical sort of classic films you want to get into, we should definitely revisit this format. It'd be great fun. So thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thanks. Bye, everybody.